Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Mallard Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. lawmg.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. Back home again in Indiana. A Bloomington man returns home after 5 years in a Venezuelan prison, and he's not taking his freedom for granted. Fresh faces dominated some of the primary races in Bloomington. What their success could say about the local political climate.
I think it says that people are ready for change here.
And small towns across Indiana are looking for ways to breathe life back into their downtowns. One model that seems to be working: a night at the movies.
It's kind of like a wildfire. The positive things that have happened from the restoration have just been amazing.
Those stories, plus the latest news headlines from across the state, right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. A Bloomington man is adjusting to life back in Indiana after spending 5 years in Venezuelan prisons. As Barbara Brozier reports, it took lots of work to get him home.
Venezuelan authorities arrested Todd Leininger 5 years ago when he was visiting the country. They accused him of aiding in the anti-government movement, but later reduced the charges. A court sentenced him to prison time and ordered Todd's release back in November. But that didn't happen, so Todd's mother tried desperately for months to get him home.
We prayed that it was coming, we believed it was coming, but every day we just didn't know.
The day they were waiting for came late last month when Venezuelan authorities suddenly released Todd and he flew to Miami. A Venezuelan official characterized it as a gesture aimed at improving U.S. relations. Over the weekend, Todd and Barbara returned to Indiana. It's a reunion that took a lot of work from Barbara and the U.S. government. She worked with Senator Todd Young and the State Department to try and secure Todd's release, and it's something he doesn't take for granted.
I'm very blessed to be alive and home, and I owe a lot of gratitude to all the people who have been praying for me and doing many things to help me get out.
Todd says he's not sure what the future holds, but he plans to take everything one day at a time. For now, he's focusing on family.
We're going to try to move forward and build our lives back, and we know everything's going to be great from here on out.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Barbara Brozier.
Todd did speak with Senator Young shortly after his release and expressed interest in working to help get other Americans imprisoned in Venezuela freed. A dispute between neighbors over logging on private property along Lake Monroe continues to move forward in court. Reporter Barbara Brozier has been following this story, this ongoing story, Barbara. So what's new?
So let's talk about how this first started. It's complicated to give people background. This initially started with some neighbors suing Joe Huff, who is a property owner nearby. And they were suing him because they said they had this agreement about shared access roads, like that one that you're seeing right there, that said they couldn't be used for certain purposes, including commercial logging, which they say is going on at his property. So they sued because they said he was in violation of that agreement.
So where do things stand now with the lawsuit?
There have been a lot of developments, Joe, but most recently, Huff is asking that the neighbors that initially sued him actually pay more than $400,000 in damages and legal fees. And that's because he says when a Monroe County judge halted logging temporarily at the property last year, that cost him money because he wasn't able to harvest timber. So he's asking to get some damages. The neighbors, in the meantime, want the judge to once again halt logging at the property, and there's a hearing on that later this month.
So what's going on right now with logging at that property? Is it still going?
So it is allowed. The Court of Appeals recently vacated the ruling from Monroe County that originally halted logging at the property. So it's perfectly legal for Huff to be taking trees down, and it is continuing. Of course, that's something neighbors remain concerned about.
So could this turn into a bigger fight where you start to get legislators or maybe Monroe County officials involved?
I wouldn't be surprised. I did speak to Bloomington Council President Dave Rollo earlier this week, not about this story, but he did say in general he thinks there needs to be some type of summit to talk about Lake Monroe with state and federal authorities and how you protect that water source.
So this will be an ongoing story. I'm sure there's
we'll
going to be a
have
lot
more in the
more
coming weeks. Absolutely.
Okay, Barbara, thank you very much. Well, Bloomington's city council race took center stage during this week's primary election. New faces will make up nearly half of the council after challengers defeated several incumbents Tuesday night. To no surprise, Bloomington Mayor John Hamilton easily won the Democratic nomination for this year's primary. Challenger Amanda Barge suspended her campaign after sexual harassment allegations. Hamilton got 86% of the vote to Barge's 14%.
I'm excited about our community's future. I'm pleased to be the Democratic nominee for the fall and look forward to working hard to make Bloomington an even better place.
But this year's primary headlines turned to city council as newcomers defeated incumbent council members Chris Sturbaum, Dorothy Granger, and Andy Ruff.
People are potentially ready for more aggressive change, so more aggressive steps toward climate action and more aggressive steps toward equity and inclusion in our community.
Our current city council has served us really well in a lot of ways, and I mean that of everybody. But we're facing some unprecedented challenges.
My hope is to add an increased awareness and sensitivity to issues of economic development and to make sure that's taken into consideration in the decisions we make on council.
Only one Republican council candidate filed ahead of the primary. Andrew Gunther will face Democrat Sue Scambelluri in the District 2 race in November. But the Republican and Libertarian parties could select more candidates if they caucus before the end of June. Terre Haute City Councilman Karim Nasser won the Democratic nomination for mayor, capturing more than 70% of the vote. He'll face incumbent Mayor Duke Bennett and independent Pat Goodwin in the general election.
I think the voters want to see someone that has a vision, that has the passion to see things through, and hopefully that I can show them that I'm that person in November.
Bennett won his third term for mayor by just more than 300 votes in 2015. Now for headlines, we go over to Barbara Brozier, who has the latest on this week's top stories.
Thanks, Joe. The funeral for former U.S. Senator Richard Lugar will be Wednesday, May 15th at St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Indianapolis. The six-term senator recently died at age 87. Lugar will lie in state at the Indiana State House Rotunda for 24 hours beginning at noon on Tuesday, after which the rotunda will be open for those who wish to pay their respects. The public is welcome until sunset. The Lugar family will greet callers from 2 to 7 that day. The funeral will be streamed live online with details announced later. Well, if you're making plans to hit the beach at Lake Monroe anytime soon, you're going to have to put them on hold. As Adam Pinsker reports, the lake is inundated from heavy rains this winter.
17,000 gallons every 2 seconds. That's how much water is being let out of Lake Monroe's dam. But it only put a dent in the lake's higher than normal lake levels, and more rain Thursday didn't help matters.
We're essentially 15 feet high, 16 feet high. So it's going to be several weeks before we can get down.
Park Director Shannon Phelps says all the beaches around the lake are flooded.
There are people that are on the upper reaches of the lake and even just across the lake from us here in the Morris Creek area that their roads are inundated. They're unable to get to their houses or their summer homes.
Phelps says the Army Corps is limited to lowering the lake a maximum of 2 inches of water per day so the communities downstream aren't jeopardized.
We have gauges that we monitor in Petersburg and Shoals. We also have a gauge in Bedford. We're allowed to release water when those gauges are at a certain level and lowering.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Adam Pinsker.
The Indiana Commission for Higher Education is recommending raising public college tuition and fees by no more than 1.65% each year until 2021. The The commission met earlier this week to set new targets for the increases. One suggestion was adding performance funding initiatives for schools that don't raise tuition and fees. Performance funding is a formula to measure degree completion and progress statistics to determine funding for a school.
The more affordable our colleges are, the more chance we have of getting students, and that's our goal.
In-state tuition and fees at public four-year colleges and universities in Indiana have increased by only 1.4% since 2009, compared to a national rate of 3.1%. Schools are not required, however, to follow the commission's recommendations. They have until June 28th to set their tuition and fees for the next biennium. Several Franklin residents say they were never told about cancer-causing chemicals at the Amphenol industrial site. As Rebecca Thiel reports, the Environmental Protection Agency's internal watchdog took residents' comments this week.
The OIG is looking into how the EPA has communicated with residents about the contamination.
They weren't aware. They weren't aware of the site. So we heard that repeatedly.
Several people who spoke at the listening session had family members with cancer or autoimmune diseases. Many of them wondered if coming into contact with contaminated groundwater, soil, or vapors could have caused those illnesses. Carrie Reinhardt lost her daughter Emma Grace to a rare brain tumor. Her nonprofit, If It Was Your Child, recently found documents showing that sewer backups were causing contaminated groundwater to get into homes in Franklin. Reinhardt says her kids could have been exposed during the 2008 flood.
I can't help but wonder, should I have walked away from my house at that time?
Mother of 5, Michelle Dahl, says she's worried to send her kids back to Webb Elementary School because toxic vapors were found underneath the building, though the inside was deemed safe. She says the EPA has dismissed her concerns, even laughed at her.
And I want the EPA to pay attention to us so they can fix my town, because this is my town, this is my home, and I don't want to leave. I won't, because I demand that something be done. Thank you.
The EPA OIG plans to prepare a report on how the EPA can improve communication by December. Loving Good says the OIG chose to look into Franklin after receiving a letter from If It Was Your Child and the nonprofit Edison Wetlands Association in January. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Rebecca Thiel.
An intergovernmental report released this week says more than 1 million plant and animal species are likely to become extinct because of humans. A professor of anthropology at Indiana University says coal-fired power plants, industrial pollution, and agriculture all likely contribute to species loss in Indiana. The report says Indiana and the rest of the world are going to have to make transformative changes, and fast, to avoid losing more than 1 million species of plants and animals. And Joe, that was actually an issue, climate change, that we saw come up in local elections this year, which is a little unusual.
And I'm sure more of that to come too.
Absolutely.
Barbara, thank you very much. Coming up next on Indiana Newsdesk. Indiana is dotted with small towns with deteriorating theaters from another age. We'll look at some communities who are whipping them into shape, hoping they'll bring life back into the heart of the town. And we tune into a time when Bloomington was a hub of radio and television production as we look at the legacy of Sarkis Tarzian. These stories and more right here on Indiana Newsdesk.
The WTIU WFIU news team connects Indiana to the world. We bring you the top news of the day on radio, TV, and online. We round up the stories that have people talking each week and dig deep into the issues that affect your community the most. The WTIU WFIU news team is where you are and telling your story.
In a time of change, where can you find in-depth reporting and thoughtful analysis? Washington Week on PBS. Join moderator Robert Costa.
When I was at the Capitol this week, I encountered the same.
And a panel of award-winning journalists.
You're seeing a divided nation, and you're seeing.
For insights and perspective.
Tonight there was a key development in the
Senate. You won't find anywhere else.
What a week.
Washington Week.
Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. A historical theater sits abandoned in the heart of Indiana's architecture capital. Indiana Landmarks recently added the Crump Theater to its list of the 10 most endangered places in the state. As Tyler Lake reports, other Indiana towns have used their historic theaters to try to bring folks back downtown.
The Crump Theater has been around since the late 19th century, but an Art Deco update in the 40s gave it the striking facade that today could use some love.
It is today one of the most visually interesting things you see coming through Columbus, and that's because it has this really interesting facade.
Richard McCoy is the director of Landmark Columbus. It's a local organization that raises awareness about the city's design heritage. He says the community is divided about wanting to preserve the Crump Theater.
What Landmark Columbus has done sort of quietly is continued to think about what it would be the highest and best use of this building. And one of the things that we've found recently is that Columbus wants a performing arts center.
McCoy says the building needs a lot of work, and it's more than just busted seats and peeling paint. The building is deemed not safe for use by the fire department. But saving the theater is about more than just bringing it up to code.
You know, there's some technical things that, an architect could work out, but then it's also really the business plan and thinking about who really is the champion of it, who owns it, who runs it.
The Columbus Capital Foundation owns the building, and it estimates that repairing and restoring the Crump could cost up to $10 million.
Maybe we ought to look at spending some community dollars and some private dollars on making sure that the people that want to do creative kinds of things have an opportunity to do that and a venue in which to do it.
Schumacher says that despite that large price tag, the Crump is the perfect place to create a modern performing arts venue. He says it's a shame the theater is sat empty since it closed back in 2014.
And quite frankly, since that point in time, it's lacked a champion, a cheerleader that says, I'm taking this on and we're going to put a group together and formalize that group and move forward with fundraising and planning and all those kinds of things.
A lot of small communities in Indiana are looking to restore their historic downtown theaters as a kind of spark to ignite a citywide renaissance. For Spencer and its Tivoli Theater, that's what's been happening.
It's kind of like a wildfire. The positive things that have happened from the restoration have just been amazing.
The Tivoli opened its doors on New Year's Eve, 1928, and it survived a lot between then and when it closed in 1999, including 2 fires in the 80s. White says the community banded together to get the pigeon-infested building back in shape, but they ran out of money. That's when Indiana Landmarks reached out to the Cook Group, which has a facility in the town that employs around 700 people. Cook jumped in and provided the funds to repair and restore the theater and reopen the doors. And just as the community played a role in cleaning up the theater, many residents are helping to keep it running. There are about 150 volunteers who help maintain and staff the space. He says the collaboration between the nonprofit Indiana Landmarks and Cook helped turn the page on the city's downtown.
In the 80s, most of the shops in the downtown faded away. And there wasn't much in the downtown area. It kind of came dead. When the theater was restored, that showed that life could be back down in the downtown area around our square.
With that same goal in mind, to bring life back to a sleepy downtown, folks in Franklin came together to drum up the money and labor needed to bring the Artcraft Theater back to life. The theater was built in the 20s, but the opulent Art Deco marquee added in the late 40s gave it the face that, thanks to a lot of hard work, it still wears today.
The city created the Franklin Development Corporation, and that helped fund restoring facades and helping out other business people get their places fixed up. And so it started to snowball. That's the exact phrase.
When Franklin Heritage took ownership of the building back in 2004, it was in need of a lot of care. The ceiling had collapsed and the building was condemned. The state awarded Franklin a $50,000 matching grant to help restore the space, but that didn't come close to covering the cost. It was a partnership between city leaders and the community that made the project a success.
And we're just adding on to the history. We're caretakers for this. We want to make sure that younger generation will pick up and say, okay, we have to keep this town going, and this is what's going to drive it.
And when you take a look at the block where the theater sits, the impact is clear. The restoration helped build up all the nearby shops and ignite the local economy. The question in Columbus, though, is could the same thing happen here? The key to success may lie in finding the right champion.
You have to be a cheerleader. You have to be that motivating force, and you have to get other people behind you.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Tyler Lake.
The Sarkis and Mary Tarzian Nature Preserve sits between Hillside Drive and the relatively secluded Davis Street near Bloomington's Bryan Park. The preserve stands as a natural monument to Sarkis Tarzian, a prominent figure in the city's history. Now, Martha Wales lives next to the property. She says she doesn't believe enough people know about the man for whom the nature preserve is named. She asked City Limits to explain why he was so important to the city. Bob Zaltzberg has this on the legacy of Sarkis Tarzian.
The Tarzian family came to the United States from Turkish Armenia. As a young man, Sarkis went to work for RCA and moved to Bloomington in 1940. 4 years later, Sarkis Tarzian Incorporated was founded. Tarzian invented a television tuner that could be mass-produced at low cost. He opened plants in Bloomington and 4 other locations. The Bloomington plant at the corner of Hillside and Woodlawn housed the tuner division. The facility is now home to Carlisle Brake and Friction. Sarkis Tarzian also loved local broadcasting. He built radio station WTTS and then had an even bolder idea, to build a commercial television station in Bloomington. Monroe County History Center exhibits manager A.J. Giannopoulos says the Tarzian Company made a huge mark on television broadcasting.
He started going into radio stations, television stations, and that's kind of where he became really well known, was the small market television stations being able to branch out and do things that the big city once could.
Television station WTTV was born in 1949. It was licensed to Bloomington and known for programs that range from Sammy Terry's horror movies to Indiana University basketball broadcasts. Sarkis Tarzian Incorporated sold WTTV in 1978, but the Tarzian family and company still owns radio and television stations in Indiana, Tennessee, and Nevada. Tom Tarzian now leads the company. He says his father was committed to building a better Bloomington beyond his own business, and that included working toward a new Bloomington hospital. Giannopoulos praises Tarzian's leadership on the hospital.
He was on the board of the board that was in charge of finding a spot and the funding to build the hospital. And I think that's maybe one of his most important legacies, is building that.
When a developer bought about 2/3 of the estate of Mary Tarzian in 1999, Sarkis Tarzian Incorporated retained ownership of a 16-acre parcel in the middle of the estate. Tom Tarzian and the company's board of directors in 2002 directed the land to be recorded as a conservation easement and managed by the Sycamore Land Trust. The property can't be developed and will remain in its natural state. That's the land Martha Wales lives next to. She says when her children were young, they thought the word Tarzian meant park. That's far from all it means to Bloomington. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Bob Zaltzberg.
We want to hear your questions about the changing face of Bloomington. You can join the conversation by going to WTIU.org/citylimits to ask your questions about the past, present, and future of the city of Bloomington. Well, a popular Sycamore Land Trust hiking trail in Ellettsville will reopen to the public next week after being closed for repairs for more than a year. Volunteers worked with Lauren Wood Builders to help replace and modernize the most used half-mile portion of the raised boardwalk at the Bean Blossom Bottoms Nature Preserve.
This started as pretty much an all-volunteer project, and volunteers built the majority of what became a 1.5-mile wetland boardwalk, which is really incredible. It's hard to find statistics on you know, what are the largest boardwalks in Indiana or the country, but as far as we know, this could be the largest one in the state. It's certainly one of the largest. It's probably one of the longest anywhere, which is really impressive. It's a really important wetland area. We have the Bean Blossom Creek coming through here. That bobcat photo was taken here at this preserve. There've been bald eagles nesting here since the mid-2000s. It's just a real little ecological jewel.
There's days we were in waders breaking ice to get in the water. So we worked, you know, on days that were 95 degrees and days that were below zero. So always in water and mud. But I'm not complaining because I love being out here. It isn't like my second home. I'm kind of sad to kind of be wrapping it up. It does take a lot of people, and I just wanted to emphasize, that it was a lot of different people that made this possible. Some volunteers would just come on their own time, and just come extra. So it wouldn't have been possible without that because it was all hand labor, and it's a big feat to take on.
Our focus is connecting people to nature and preserving nature, and that connection is really vital to protection. People have to connect to nature to get enthused about protecting it. It's going to allow more people to get out here and experience nature and understand why it's important to protect.
The preserve will reopen the 2.5-mile boardwalk trail to the public with a special celebration on May 18th. And that's the end of this program, but our work continues online as we cover the news throughout the week at WTIUnews.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Mallard Grodner Attorneys providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.